Chapter 9. Another view of the ether. Material and ethereal bodies. We have supposed in the case of a plane world that the surface on which the movements take place is inactive, except by its vibrations. It is simply a smooth support. For the sake of simplicity, let us call this smooth surface the ether in the case of a plane world. The ether then we have imagined to be simply a smooth, thin sheet, not possessed of any definite structure, but excited by real disturbances of the matter on it into vibrations, which carry the effect of these disturbances as light and heat to other portions of matter. Now, it is possible to take an entirely different view of the ether in the case of a plane world. Let us imagine that, instead of the ether being a smooth sheet serving simply as a support, it is definitely marked and grooved. Let us imagine these grooves and channels to be very minute, but to be definite and permanent. Then, let us suppose that, instead of the matter which slides in the ether having attractions and repulsions of its own, that it is quite inert, and has only the properties of inertia. That is to say, taking a disk or a plane world as a specimen, the whole disk is sliding on the ether in virtue of a certain momentum which it has, and certain portions of its matter fit into the grooves in the ether, and move along those grooves. The size of the portions is determined by the size of the grooves. And let us call those portions of matter which occupy the breadth of a groove atoms. Then it is evident that the disk sliding along over the ether, its atoms will move according to the arrangement of the grooves over which the disk slides. If the grooves at any one particular place come close together, there will be a condensation of matter at that place when the disk passes over it, and if the grooves separate, there will be a rarefaction of matter. If we imagine 5 particles, each slipping along in its own groove, if the particles are arranged in the form of a regular pentagon, and the grooves are parallel, then these 5 particles, moving evenly on, will maintain their positions with regard to one another, and a body would exist like a pentagon, lasting as long as the grooves remained parallel. But if, after some distance had been traversed by the disk, and these 5 particles were brought into a region where one of the grooves tended away from the others, the shape of the pentagon would be destroyed. It would become some irregular figure. And it is easy to see that if the grooves separated, and other grooves came in amongst them, along which other portions of matter were sliding, that the pentagon would disappear as an isolated body, that its constituent matter would be separated, and that its particles would enter into other shapes as constituents of them, and not of the original pentagon. Thus, in cases of greater complication, an elaborate structure may be supposed to be formed, to alter, and to pass away, its origin, growth, and decay being due, not to any independent motion of the particles constituting it, but to the movement of the disk whereby its portions of matter were brought to regions where there was a particular disposition of the grooves. Then the nature of the shape would really be determined by the grooves, not by the portions of matter which passed over them. They would become manifest as giving rise to a material form when a disk passed over them, but they would subsist independently of the disk. And if another disk were to pass over the same grooves, exactly the same material structures would spring up as came into being before. If we make a similar supposition about our ether along which our earth slides, we may conceive the movements of the particles of matter to be determined, not by attractions or repulsions exerted on one another, but to be set in existence by the alterations in the directions of the grooves of the ether along which they are proceeding. If the grooves were all parallel, the earth would proceed without any other motion than that of its path in the heavens. but with an alteration in the direction of the grooves, the particles, instead of proceeding uniformly with the mass of the earth, would begin to move amongst each other. And by a sufficiently complicated arrangement of grooves it may be supposed that all the movements of the forms we see around us are due to interweaving and variously disposed grooves. Thus the movements, which any body goes through, would depend on the arrangement of the ethereal grooves along which it was passing. As long as the grooves remain grouped together in approximately the same way, it would maintain its existence as the same body, but when the grooves separated and became involved with the grooves of other objects, this body would cease to exist separately. Thus the separate existences of the earth might conceivably be due to the disposition of those parts of the ether over which the earth passed. And thus any object would have to be separated into two parts, one the ethereal form, or modification which lasted, the other the material particles which, coming on with blind momentum, were directed into such movements as to produce the actual objects around us. In this way there would be two parts in any organism, the material part and the ethereal part. There would be the material body, which soon passes and becomes indistinguishable from any other material body, and the ethereal body which remains. Now, if we direct our attention to the material body, we see the phenomena of growth, decay, and death, the coming and the passing away of a living being, isolated during his existence, absolutely merged at his death into the common storehouse of matter. But if we regard the ethereal body, we find something different. We find an organism which is not so absolutely separated from the surrounding organisms, an organism which is part of the ether, and which is linked to other ethereal organisms by its very substance, an organism between which and others there exists a unity incapable of being broken, and a common life which is rather marked than revealed by the matter which passes over it. The ethereal body, moreover, remains permanently when the material body has passed away. The correspondences between the ethereal body and the life of an organism such as we know is rather to be found in the emotional region than in the one of outward observation. To the ethereal form, all parts of it are equally one, but part of this form corresponds to the future of the material being, part of it to his past. Thus, care for the future and regard for the past would be the way in which the material being would exhibit the unity of the ethereal body, which is both his past, his present, and his future. That is to say, suppose the ethereal body capable of receiving an injury in one part of it would correspond to an injury in a man's past, an injury in another part, that which the material body was traversing, would correspond to an injury to the man at the present moment, injury to the ethereal body at another part, would correspond to injury coming to the man at some future time. And the self-preservation of the ethereal body, supposing it to have such a motive, would in the last case be the motive of regarding his own future to the man. And inasmuch as the man felt the real unity of his ethereal body, and did not confine his attention to his material body, which is absolutely disunited at every moment from its future and its past, inasmuch as he apprehended his ethereal unity, insomuch would he care for his future welfare, and consider it as equal in importance to his present comfort. The correspondence between emotion and physical fact would be that the emotion of regard corresponded to an undiscerned ethereal unity. And then also, just as the two tips of two fingers put down on a plane would seem to a plane being to be two completely different bodies, not connected together, So one and the same ethereal body might appear as two distinct material bodies, and any regard between the two would correspond to an apprehension of their ethereal unity. In the supposition of an ethereal body, it is not necessary to keep to the idea of the rigidity and permanence of the grooves defining the motion of the matter which, passing along, exhibits the material body. The ethereal body may have a life of its own, relations with other ethereal bodies, and a life as full of vicissitudes as that of the material body, which in its total orbit expresses in the movements of matter one phase in the life of the ethereal body. But there are certain obvious considerations which prevent any serious dwelling on these speculations. They are only introduced here in order to show how the conception of higher space lends itself to the representation of certain indefinite apprehensions, such as that of the essential unity of the race, and affords a possible clue to correspondences between the emotional and the physical life. The whole question of our relation to the tether has to be settled. That which we call the ether is far more probably the surface of a liquid, and the phenomena we observe due to surface tensions. Indeed, the physical questions concern us here nothing at all. It is easy enough to make some supposition which gives us a standing ground to discipline our higher space perception. And when that is trained, we shall turn round and look at the facts. The conception which we shall form of the universe will undoubtedly be as different from our present one, as the Copernican view differs from the more pleasant view of a wide immovable earth beneath a vast vault. Indeed, any conception of our place in the universe will be more agreeable than the thought of being on a spinning ball, kicked into space without any means of communication with any other inhabitants of the universe.